When to this sense of fear and evil, the inevitable fascination of wonder and curiosity is superadded, there is born a composite body of keen emotion and imaginative provocation, whose vitality must of necessity endure as long as the human race itself. Children will always be afraid of the dark, and men with minds sensitive to hereditary impulse will always tremble at the thought of the hidden and fathomless worlds of strange life which may pulse in the gulfs beyond the stars, or press hideously upon our own globe in unholy dimensions which only the dead and moonstruck can glimpse. With this foundation, no one need wonder at the existence of a literature of cosmic fear. It has always existed and always will exist, and no better evidence of its tenacious vigor can be cited than the impulse which now and then drives writers of totally opposite leanings to try their hands at it in isolated tales, as if to discharge from their minds certain phantasmal shapes which would otherwise haunt them. Thus, Dickens wrote several eerie narratives, Browning the hideous poem, Childe Roland, Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, Dr. Holmes, the subtle novel, Elsie Venner, F. Marion Crawford, The Upper Berth, and a number of other examples, Miss Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Social Worker, The Yellow Wallpaper, whilst the humorist W. W. Jacobs produced that melodramatic bit called The Monkey's Paw. The type of fear literature must not be confounded with the type of externally similar but psychologically widely different. The literature of mere physical fear and the mundanely gruesome. Such writing, to be sure, has its place, as has the conventional or even whimsical or humorous ghost story, where formalism or the author's knowing wink removes the true sense of the morbidly unnatural. But these things are not the literature of cosmic fear in its purest sense. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, blood bones, or a sheeted form, clanking chains, according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and a portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and peculiar suspension, our subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Naturally, we cannot expect all weird tales to conform absolutely to any theoretical model. Creative minds are uneven, and the best of fabrics have their dull spots. Moreover, much of the choicest weird work is unconscious, appearing in memorable fragments scattered through material whose massed effect may be of a different cast. Atmosphere is the all-important thing, for the final criterion of authenticity is not the dovetailing of a plot, but the creation of a given sensation. We may say, as a general thing, that a weird story whose intent to teach or produce a social effect, or one in which the horrors are finally explained away by natural means, is not a genuine tale of cosmic fear, but it remains a fact that such narratives often possess, in isolated sections, atmospheric touches which fulfill every condition of true supernatural horror literature. Therefore, we must judge a weird tale not by the author's intent or by the mere mechanics of the plot, but by the emotional level which it attains at its least mundane point. If the proper sensations are excited, such a high spot must be admitted on its own merits as weird literature, no matter how prosaically it is later dragged down. The one test of the really weird is simply this: whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread and of contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's utmost rim. And of course, the more completely and unifiedly a story conveys this atmosphere, the better it is as a work of art in the given medium. Part 2. Dawn of the Horror Tale. As may naturally be expected of a form so closely connected with primal emotion, the horror tale is as old as human thought and speech themselves. Cosmic terror appears as an ingredient of the earliest folklore of all races, and is crystallized in the most archaic ballads, chronicles, and sacred writings. It was, indeed, a prominent feature of the elaborate ceremonial magic, with its rituals for the evocation of demons and specters, which flourished from prehistoric times, and which reached its highest development in Egypt and the Semitic nations. Well, what about India? Fragments like the Book of Enoch and the Clavicula of Solomon well illustrate the power of the weird over the ancient Eastern mind, and upon such things were based enduring systems and traditions whose echoes extend obscurely even to the present time. Touches of this transcendental fear are seen in classic literature, and there is evidence of its still greater emphasis in a ballad literature which paralleled the classic stream, but vanished for lack of a written medium. The Middle Ages, steeped in fanciful darkness, gave it an enormous impulse toward expression, and East and West alike were busy preserving and amplifying the dark heritage, both of random folklore and of academically formulated magic and cabalism, which had descended to them. Witch, werewolf, vampire, and ghoul brooded ominously on the lips of bard and grandam, and needed but little the formal literary composition. In the Orient, the weird tale tended to assume a gorgeous coloring and sprightliness, which almost transmuted into sheer fantasy. In the West, where the mystical Teuton had come down from his black boreal forests, and the Celt remembered strange sacrifices in druidic groves, it has assumed a terrible intensity and convincing seriousness of atmosphere which doubled the force of its half-told, half-hinted horrors. Much of the power of Western horror lore was undoubtedly due to the hidden but often suspected presence of a hideous cult of nocturnal worshippers whose strange customs descended from pre-Aryan and pre-agricultural times, when a squat race of Mongoloids roved over Europe with their flocks and herds, were rooted in the most revolting fertility rites of immemorial antiquity. This secret religion, stealthily handed down amongst the peasants for thousands of years, despite the outward reign of Druidic, Greco-Roman, and Christian faiths in the regions involved, was marked by wild witches' Sabbaths in lonely woods atop distant hills on Walpurgis Night and Halloween. And more anciently, before the Christians, it was the cross-quarter nights. Both of those are not those, but the traditional breeding sessions of the goats and sheep and cattle, and became the source of vast riches of sorcery legend, besides provoking extensive witchcraft, prosecutions of which the Salem affair forms the chief American example. Akin to it in essence, and perhaps connected with it in fact, was the frightful secret system of inverted theology of Satan worship, which produced such horrors as the famous Black Mass. Whilst operating toward the same end, we may note the activities of those whose aims were somewhat more scientific or philosophical. The astrologers, Kabbalists, and alchemists of the Albertus Magnus or Raymond Lully type, with whom such rude ages invariably abound. The prevalence and deep of the medieval horror spirit in Europe, intensified by dark despair which waves of pestilence brought, may be fairly gauged by the grotesque carvings slyly introduced into much of the finest later Gothic ecclesiastical work of the time. The demoniac gargoyles of Notre Dame and Mont St. Michael being among the most famous specimens, and through the period it must be remembered there existed, amongst educated and uneducated alike, a most unquestioned faith in every form of the supernatural, from the gentlest of the Christian doctrines to the most monstrous morbidities of witchcraft and black magic. It was from no empty background that the Renaissance magicians and alchemists, Nostradamus, Trithemius, Dr. John Dee, Robert Flude, and the like were born. I knew he had a background, but that's some impressive listening right there. In this fertile soil were nourished types and characters of somber myth and legend which persisted in weird literature to this day, more or less disguised or altered by modern technique. Many of them were taken from the earliest oral sources and form part of mankind's permanent heritage. The shade which appears and demands the burial of its bones, the diamond lover who comes to bear away his still living bride, the death fiend or psychopomp riding the night wind, the man wolf, the sealed chamber, the deathless sorcerer, all these may be found in that curious body of medieval lore which the late Mr. Baring Gould so effectively assembled in book form. Wherever the mystic northern blood was strongest, the atmosphere of the popular tales became most intense. For in the Latin races there is a touch of the basic rationality which denies, even to their strangest superstitions, many of the overtones of glamour so characteristic of our own forest-born and ice-fostered whisperings. So say fiction is taking the place of mythology. Just as all fiction first found extensive embodiment in poetry, so it is in poetry that we first encounter the permanent entry of the weird into the standard literature. Most of the ancient instances, curiously enough, are in prose, as the werewolf incident in Petronius, the gruesome passages in Apuleius, the brief but celebrated letter of Pliny the Younger to Sura, and the odd compilation on wonderful events by the Emperor Hadrian's Greek freedman, Phlegon. And it is in Phlegon that we first find that hideous tale of the corpse bride, Philenion and Macates, later related by Proclus, and in modern times forming the inspiration of Goethe's Bride of Corinth and Washington Irving's German Student. But by the time the old northern myths take literary form, and that latter time when the weird appears as a steady element in the literature of the day, we find it mostly in metrical dress, as indeed we find the greater part of the strictly imaginative writings of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Indeed, we find the greater part of the Scandinavian Eddas and sagas thunder with cosmic horror, and shake with the stark fear of Ymir and his shapeless spawn. Whilst our own Anglo-Saxon Beowulf and the latter continental Nibelung tales are full of eldritch weirdness, Dante is a pioneer in the classic capture of macabre atmosphere, and in Spenser's stately stanzas will be seen more than a few touches of fantastic terror in landscape, incident, and character. Prose literature gives us Malory's Morte d'Arthur, in which are presented many ghastly situations taken from early ballad sources. The theft of the sword and silk from the corpse in Chapel Perilous by Sir Lancelot, the ghost of Sir Gawain, the tomb fiend seen by Sir Galahad, whilst other and cruder specimens were doubtless set forth in the cheap and sensational chapbooks vulgarly hawked about and devoured by the ignorant in Elizabethan drama, with its Dr. Faustus, the witches in Macbeth, the ghost in Hamlet, and the horrible gruesomeness of Webster. We may easily discern the strong hold of the demoniac on the public mind, a hold intensified by the very real fear of living witchcraft, whose terrors, first wildest on the continent, begin to echo loudly in English ears as the witch-hunting crusades of James I gain headway. To the lurking mystical prose of the ages is added a long line of treatises on witchcraft and demonology, which aid in exciting the imagination of the reading world. Through the 17th and into the 18th century, we behold a growing mass of fugitive, legendary, and balladry of darksome cast, still, however, held down beneath the surface of polite and accepted literature. Chapbooks of horror and weirdness multiplied, and we glimpse the eager interest of woman's spectral visit to a distant friend, written to advertise covertly a bad-selling theological disquisition on death. The upper orders of society were now losing faith in the supernatural and indulging in a period of classic rationalism, then beginning with the translations of Eastern tales in Queen Anne's reign and taking definite form toward the middle of the century, comes the revival of romantic feeling, the era of new joy in nature and the radiance of past times, strange scenes, bold deeds, and incredible marvels. We feel it first in the poets whose utterances take on new weird scenes in the novels of the day, such as Smollett's Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom. The released instinct precipitates itself in the birth of a new school of writing, the Gothic school of horrible and fantastic prose fiction, long and short, whose literary posterity is destined to become so numerous and in many cases so resplendent in artistic merit. It is, when one reflects upon it, genuinely remarkable that weird narration as a fixed and academically recognized literary form should have been so late of final birth. The impulse and atmosphere are as old as man, but the typical weird tale of standard literature is as a child of the 18th century.